Hi, I'm Beth. Today I'm going to go over anosognosia and what we think is going on in the brains of these patients. Primarily, we're going to look at anosognosia through the lens of lateralization and explore how right hemisphere damage impacts reasoning. So, as a refresh, anosognosia is a condition in which a person with a disability or deficit is unaware of having it. It can manifest in many ways, denial of mental illness, for instance. Ramachandran writes about anosognosia with hemiplegia. The patients he described have right brain strokes that resulted in paralysis of the left side. That's the hemiplegia part. The anosognosia part is that none of these patients is aware that they are paralyzed. They are in complete denial. For example, Mrs. Dodds, whose entire left side was paralyzed. Dr. Ramachandran asked her if she could walk, and she said yes. He asked her if she could use her hands. She said yes. He asked her if she could touch his nose with her left paralyzed hand. She said yes again. What's more, she reported that she could see herself touching his nose. Now, Mrs. Dodds is somewhat of an extreme case. Ramachandran had another patient with anosognosia that rationalized not touching his nose by saying that she was tired and didn't want to move her arm. These patients are clearly having delusions. And I think it's helpful to take a moment to conceptualize what delusions are. Coulthart's two-factor theory of delusions is a very useful tool for that. He contends that two factors must be present for a delusion to resolve. First, there has to be something anomalous that requires an explanation. For instance, hearing voices that aren't there, or suddenly being unable to move your arm. Secondly, there must be an evaluative system that fails to reject implausible explanations. Take Charles Bonnet syndrome, for instance. It fulfills the first factor, patients experience visions, but their evaluative system is working, so they correctly identify those visions as hallucinations, and therefore they are not delusional. That's not the case in anosognosia. The evaluative system in anosognosia most definitely fails. Ramachandran contends that the evaluative system that has failed is localized in the right hemisphere. He writes that the left hemisphere's job is to create a belief system or model and to fold new experiences into that belief system. The right hemisphere's strategy, on the other hand, is to play devil's advocate. So in anosognosia, patients have a long-standing belief that they are not paralyzed, and without the right brain to contest that, the belief persists. So when Ramachandran posits this theory in the book, he makes it sound very, very speculative, kind of like he's spitballing. So I was very curious to see if in the last 20 years there had been evidence for this theory. And there has been. There is now very robust evidence that the right and left brain have different approaches to reasoning, inferential reasoning in particular. These differences have been conceptualized in a few different ways, but researchers have consistently found that the left brain makes inferences and interprets information based on previous knowledge. The left brain's goal seems to be to reduce uncertainty and ambiguity. The right brain, on the other hand, deals well with ambiguity. It seems designed to detect conflict and inconsistencies. The right brain is essential for updating beliefs. I keep thinking how closely this division of labor resembles Piaget's model of assimilation and accommodation. The left hemisphere assimilates information into an existing framework, while the right hemisphere changes the framework to accommodate new information when it doesn't fit. So I've pulled some examples from the literature to kind of illustrate these divisions. Here, Goal used anagram tasks to demonstrate the left and right brain's response to ambiguity. When the task is presented very simply as it is here, make the word knife, the left hemisphere handles it beautifully. But when the task is presented with a little more ambiguity, here we see the instruction, make a word for a kitchen utensil, the right brain is recruited and we see more activation in the right prefrontal cortex. So for another example, Gazangia performed a whole host of experiments exploring the left brain's facility with inferences and explanations. For instance, he might show a split brain patient of these two images. When shown to the patient's left side, the patient would be able to infer that match plus logs equal fire, and he'd be able to pick that image out of this array. The right side cannot perform this task. There's also been work by Gold showing that the right brain is much more skeptical than the left. He showed patients with left brain lesions a series of inductive reasoning arguments, which were two premises followed by a conclusion, and they ranged from highly believable to least believable. An example of a highly believable premise is that nicotine is known to cause cancer. Chewing tobacco contains nicotine, so chewing tobacco causes cancer. The patients with left brain lesions rated this statement as much less plausible than people with intact brains or with right brain lesions, showing that the right brain is a much more skeptical reasoner. Finally, we have a study that shows how important the right brain is to updating beliefs. Brownwell and team would present patients with right brain lesions with a pair of premises, and they would manipulate which order they presented them in. When Barbara became too bored to finish the history book is presented first, the automatic inference you make is that she became too bored to finish reading the book. However, immediately after that, you read she had already spent 5 years writing it, and you realize that the correct inference is Barbara became bored writing a history book. These patients, however, without the right brain, could not overcome that initial incorrect inference. And they persisted in believing that Barbara became bored reading the history book. That's the phenomenon we see in our anosognosia patients. They have a prior belief that they are not paralyzed and they are unable to update their beliefs. Both these brain systems clearly have important roles to play, and it's kind of an amazing, intricate dance that they do to allow us to reason rationally, reasonably, change our minds, but still maintain some sort of continuity in our daily lives. It's pretty remarkable. Thank you.